He never set out to become one of the most powerful voices in media. He was just a guy famous enough to get interesting people on a microphone, curious enough to keep them talking for hours, and authentic enough that millions of strangers felt like they genuinely knew him. For years, that was the entire formula. No corporate backing, no editorial oversight, no agenda hidden beneath the surface, just long, wandering, honest conversation. But platforms have a way of outgrowing the people who build them. And when a platform becomes large enough, powerful enough, and valuable enough, the elites it once questioned start showing up at the door, not as targets, but as guests. Not to be challenged, but to be welcomed. What began as casual late-night conversations with comedians and curious thinkers slowly transformed into something far more calculated. Boardrooms replaced backstages. Billionaires replaced buddies. Political endorsements replaced political neutrality. And the man that millions of people felt they could trust started drifting, slowly at first, then all at once, into the very world he had spent years warning his audience about. His show has fallen from the #1 podcast in the world to #5. And for those who have been paying close attention, the decline did not arrive suddenly. It was built, decision by decision, over several years. There were 6 key moments where the road forked. And each time, he chose the path that moved him further from who he used to be. The first crack appeared in 2020. A licensing agreement, reportedly worth $100 million, took his show exclusively to a single streaming platform. Nobody could reasonably blame him for signing it. Life-changing money at that scale is not something most people walk away from. But the consequences arrived almost immediately, and they were impossible to dismiss. Over 100 episodes disappeared from the archive. More than 300 hours of content gone without ceremony. Conversations with comedians, fighters, fringe scientists, and controversial thinkers were quietly erased. These were not obscure episodes. They were among the most beloved in the show's history. The kind of conversations that made people feel like they were listening in on something real, something unfiltered, something that could not exist anywhere else. The reaction from fans was visceral. What made the show extraordinary was precisely that nothing had ever been off limits. A 3-hour conversation could begin with quantum physics and end with someone describing a ridiculous personal disaster at 2 in the morning. Flat Earth theorists sat across from Nobel laureates. Conspiracy researchers shared airtime with mainstream journalists. The unpredictability was not a bug. It was the entire point. And now a corporation had editorial authority over what stayed and what vanished. What made the situation worse was the response. When critics publicly described what happened as censorship, he defended the platform completely. He insisted that no pressure had been applied, that no directives had been issued, that everything was fine. The irony was suffocating, because just a few years earlier, he had loudly and passionately criticized other major tech platforms for doing the exact same thing to political voices on the right. He had called it dangerous. He had called it an attack on the free exchange of ideas. Now it had happened to his own library, and suddenly it was nothing worth discussing. The show remained dominant. The money was real, and most fans were willing to extend the benefit of the doubt. But the trust, invisible and previously unquestioned, had developed its first visible fracture. The second decision came shortly after. He relocated his entire operation from Los Angeles to Austin, Texas. On paper, it was a reasonable move. Taxes were dramatically lower. The weather was comparable. Austin had a growing creative community. He was far from the only wealthy Californian making that same journey south and east during that particular period. But Los Angeles had always been more than a backdrop. It was infrastructure. The intellectuals, entertainers, athletes, scientists, and genuine eccentrics who made his show feel unpredictable and alive passed through Southern California constantly. They ended up in front of his microphone almost by accident, because they were already nearby, already in the same orbit, already connected through the dense and overlapping networks that only a city like Los Angeles can generate. Austin, for all its energy and ambition, simply could not replicate that gravitational pull. He attempted to build the scene from scratch. He opened a comedy club, convinced friends and fellow comedians to relocate, and began talking about Austin the way a developer talks about a neighborhood he is trying to flip. Some of his closest friends followed. A community formed, but the seams showed quickly. Critics, including some of his own peers, pointed out that the club felt less like an open creative space and more like a private club with an invisible membership requirement. That the comedy being produced there was increasingly defined not by what it was for, but by what it was against. That being anti-establishment had quietly replaced the harder and more honest work of actually being funny. A scene built around opposition eventually runs out of material. And several respected voices in comedy began saying out loud what others were only whispering, that what was being constructed in Austin had more in common with a fortress than a stage. The third problem arrived in 2024, and it was the most publicly visible one yet. He released a stand-up special he had reportedly been developing for 6 years. Given how frequently and passionately he had spoken about the craft of comedy, treating it with the reverence most people reserve for surgery or classical music, the anticipation was real. The response was not. Audiences did not laugh in the places where laughter was expected. Critics did not soften their reviews out of respect for his history, and the clips that spread across the internet were not the triumphant ones. They were the ones where setups arrived, lingered, and then quietly dissolved without a punchline ever appearing. What made this particularly damaging was not the special itself, but the distance between the special and the self-image he had spent years constructing. He had described himself as belonging to an extraordinarily small group of elite comedians, perhaps 250 people on Earth, who truly understood the art form at the highest level. He had explained the craft in meticulous detail to some of the most respected comedians alive, speaking with an authority that bordered on professorial. The gap between that self-presentation and what appeared on screen was not small. It was enormous, and even his most loyal audience struggled to bridge it. For most of his career, his greatest asset was balance. He talked about drug policy, government surveillance, corporate greed, and individual freedom without ever planting a flag in partisan soil. Conservatives felt heard. Progressives felt heard. Libertarians, skeptics, and genuinely undecided people all found something in his show that felt honest and untribal. That neutrality was not accidental. It was the foundation of his credibility, and he understood it. The 2024 presidential election changed all of that permanently. He hosted one candidate for several hours in a conversation that felt relaxed, open, and almost reverential. The other candidate was extended an invitation, but the meeting never materialized, disputed by both sides and never resolved cleanly. Just before Election Day, he posted a public endorsement. The centrist was gone. In his place stood someone who had clearly been spending considerable time in a very particular social and ideological circle. The show that had once made everyone feel welcome now felt like it had chosen a side. And the audience that had trusted him precisely because he had never done that began, quietly and then loudly, to reassess. The fifth shift was perhaps the most philosophically significant because it represented a direct betrayal of the worldview he had built his entire identity around. There was a version of this show, the version that made it matter, where power was always questioned, where pharmaceutical executives, intelligence agencies, government narratives, and tech monopolies were treated as subjects of scrutiny rather than sources of authority. That skepticism was not a performance. It felt genuine. It was why ordinary people felt like he was on their side. But something changed when the billionaires started arriving. He began describing these new friendships with a kind of pride that felt uncomfortably close to name-dropping. He welcomed onto his platform the co-founder of a major surveillance technology company, a firm with extensive contracts across military intelligence, immigration enforcement, and foreign governments, and spent hours in conversation with him, without asking a single substantive question about any of it. The guest steered the entire conversation. He talked about philosophy, about elites, about conspiracy theories involving other powerful people. And his host followed along, entertained, curious, and entirely uncritical. When the subject of a notorious financier with connections to intelligence agencies and political elites came up, his host turned the lens outward, toward other billionaires, toward political figures, toward abstract theories, while the man sitting directly across from him, a man with documented proximity to many of those same networks, was never once asked a direct question. When a close friend later pointed out that the guest had been consistently evasive and possibly dishonest throughout the episode, the response was immediate and defensive. The billionaire was protected. The friend was gently dismissed. Later, in a different conversation without the cameras pointed at anyone important, he finally said the things he should have said to the guest's face. He speculated. He questioned. He connected the dots, but none of it happened when it would have mattered. Saying the dangerous thing only after the door is closed is not courage. It is the opposite. The same dynamic repeated with other powerful guests. A former intelligence operative who answered every probing question with elaborately constructed non-answers. A venture capitalist who arrived with a fully prepared narrative and never deviated from it. A tech executive who treated every interview as a brand management exercise. Each time, the expected pushback never came. Each time, the host who once made his name on skepticism sat back and let the powerful set the terms. The sixth and final shift is the one that cuts deepest, because it is the most direct contradiction of everything he once represented. Artificial intelligence has become something approaching a religious conviction for him. He shared a digitally manipulated video of a political figure during a live broadcast, and when his own producer immediately identified it as AI-generated, he resisted. He pushed back. He suggested his producer was wrong. He seemed genuinely unwilling to accept that he had been deceived, not because the evidence was unclear, but because the deception aligned with something he already believed to be true. He has used AI-powered search tools as factual sources during live conversations, dismissing his producer's corrections with a confidence that had no grounding in anything verifiable. He has played AI-generated music to guests at length, treating it as a cultural revelation rather than a technological novelty. He has drawn theological comparisons between artificial intelligence and spiritual figures, suggesting with apparent sincerity that the digital future being constructed by the people he now calls friends might represent something sacred. His producer, a person who had spent well over a decade finding real articles, real scientific studies, real source material, and real context to keep conversations anchored in something factual, has been effectively replaced by a sponsored tool. The human in the room who once quietly served as a check on the conversation's relationship with reality has been sidelined. That detail, small as it sounds, says something significant about the direction of travel. One of his closest friends has taken to dropping small provocations into their conversations. The kind of sideways questions and half-finished observations that used to open into long, exploratory tangents about power, corruption, and the hidden mechanics of the world. Those same provocations now get deflected, changed, shut down. The friend who sounds genuinely bewildered by the current state of things gets told to relax, to come hang out, to stop reading so much. This from a man who recently admitted publicly that the news has become too overwhelming for him. That he has to stay offline, because the volume of troubling information is affecting his sleep. There is a painful irony embedded in that admission, because a meaningful portion of what is now unfolding in the world was shaped, at least in part, by an endorsement he delivered from his own microphone to tens of millions of people. He built everything on a specific promise, not a formal one, never stated outright, but understood by everyone who listened. The promise was that he would follow curiosity wherever it led, that he would question power regardless of who held it. that he would never become the thing he criticized. Somewhere between the $100 million deal, the relocation, the billionaire friendships, the political endorsement, the failed special, and the AI gospel, that promise was broken. Not dramatically, not with a single visible moment of betrayal, but gradually, through accumulation, through comfort, through the slow and almost imperceptible process of becoming exactly what proximity to power tends to make people. He is not a villain. He is not corrupt in any simple or cartoonish sense. He is something more complicated and in many ways more disappointing, a man who got too comfortable, who confused access with insight, who mistook being liked by powerful people for being independent of them, who, somewhere along the way, stopped fighting and started submitting. The curiosity that once made him impossible to look away from still surfaces occasionally, in a fleeting tangent, in a moment of unguarded honesty, in a conversation where the older version of him seems to briefly re-emerge before retreating again behind the newer, more polished, more protected version. But those moments are getting rarer. The audience is noticing, and the numbers are reflecting what the audience already feels. The man who once questioned everything is now most comfortable when he questions nothing at all.